everybody. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers for this event. And pardon me if my voice is a little hoarse, but I will try to speak in the clearest possible way. So the topic of my talk today will be looking at Old Chinese morphology through Warring States scribal practices, but we are also going to look at some examples from Western Han excavated texts. And I would like to start this talk with a quotation from a chapter by Wolfgang Baer, who argues in relation to the reconstruction of Old Chinese morphology that perhaps linguistic approaches to excavated texts have simply not yet looked hard enough behind the intricate veil of the early writing system. So this is exactly the direction in which I would like to frame this presentation. And the leading research question will be, how can we integrate paleographic evidence into research on Old Chinese derivational morphology? So the answer to this question is, we could answer to this question in 3 points. First of all, we know that paleographic evidence sometimes highlights some etymological connections that are not really any longer visible in the standardized script. This example here is very famous, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But we are going to concentrate on the second and the third point. Actually, we will look at the second one in a very briefly, and we will spend more time on examples for the third point. So investigating pre-initials and looking at Middle Chinese reading, so the data we get from medieval character dictionaries. Now, investigating pre-initials. I would like to make this point just with one example. It's more a proof of concept, but I'm happy to hear your feedback on this. This character here, this is a very nice variant we have in the Anhui University's Zhang for the character, for the entry Lu, Fu Lu, the Lu, meaning captive or prisoner. Now, we can see that the phonophore here is clearly Pi Fu, the Fu, okay? And if we look at the way Baxter and Sagar reconstructed, we can see that they posit a pre-initial as C, so it can be PT or K usually, but they're not really sure on the value of this pre-initial. And of course, this phonophore here would point towards a pre-initial P, which I think is entirely reasonable, because this would make this entry here a potential cognate of Fu, Fulu the Fu, also meaning captive or prisoner. Now, on the basis of this hypothesis, we could also scan the vocabulary and look for other potential cognates, and we can find different pra syllable typed verbs, meaning to lay the hand on, to catch, to support with the hand. And this character here with the Wu phonophore is very interesting. I was wondering if this Wu phonophore could be a hint of a prefix M that we find, for example, in the reconstruction for Fu Shao, the Fu, okay? Or I don't know, Han Wu Yun reconstructs it with a voiceless resonant, but this cannot work in the Baxter and Sagar reconstruction. So this is just speculation, but I mean, we can find different verbs that seem to share the same root. And if we look at the way these two entries are glossed in the Shuo and Jiezi, we can see that they are both glossed with huo, the huo, so to obtain, which again seems somehow semantically close. As we can see, the Fu, the captives, are what the Jun, the troops, obtain, okay? Now, can there be an etymological connection between this Fu and huo? Again, we could hypothesize different scenarios. First of all, we could hypothesize that the P results from the labialization of, from the labialization of a uvular, which is something that has been proposed by Zhao Tong in his description of the distinctive features of the true dialect. It's also something that has been upheld by other scholars. And we also have some other examples, some parallels in other languages. This one is very famous in ancient Greek, the Mycenaean poukoro, cowherd evolving to classical Greek bukolos, okay, so labializing. This is one scenario. Another scenario could be something similar to what Baxter and Sagar have recently observed. So basically, some example of cognates where we have an alternation between a uvular and a labial, and they seem to go back to a root, to a root starting with a labial, okay? So we need definitely more data, more pairs to further investigate this, but there could be some relation between a uvular and a velar, and so we could probably end up with a broader word family like this one, including also verbs meaning 获, like 获得, the 获, so to obtain, to catch, to grasp. Again, this is only tentative. I'm happy to discuss with you later about this. So the point I want to focus more in this presentation is using paleographic evidence to shed new light or to look at the distinction we find in medieval character dictionaries. So before delving into the discussion of the examples, I would like just to start with the definition of what graphemes are in the Warring States script. So we know that graphemes usually correspond to the smallest written signs corresponding to a contrastive unit of speech. We also know that in a logographic script, also semantic components are indeed graphemic. But what about the bamboo slip writing? Well, as you can see here, in the first line, we have 4 different variants of the character or wu, okay, from the 性情论 manuscript. The difference here is basically in the addition of some additional strokes, which are not really contrasted throughout the manuscripts. So we can speculate that they are perhaps something relating to the decoration of the script. We don't know, but they don't seem to be contrastive, and therefore I think they're non-graphemic strokes. Another example, we have 2 variants of the verb when, to hear. In the first example, we have an additional component R on the top. They also come from the same manuscript, from the Baoshan Wenshu. And again, this is not contrastive in the manuscript, so this is probably not a graphemic contrast. On the other side, of course, even single strokes can be graphemic in the bamboo slip writing. This is a very illustrative example. The difference between the zhi and the chu, so the grammatical particle and the verb, is basically the curvature of one stroke. This is indeed graphemic. This has to do with a distinction between the different characters, okay? So the examples we are going to look at today are somehow a subset of a broader phenomenon that has been acknowledged in the literature with the name of 一体分工, okay, so division of labor between allographs. Wang Ziyang defines the 一体分工 phenomenon as a practice within a given writing system where the writer intentionally chooses different variant forms of the same character to represent its different usages. Of course, not all cases of 一体分工 relate to derivational morphology. Sometimes it's just a matter of semantic nuance, okay? But we can indeed isolate a subset of examples that seem to relate with somehow a reading alternation that we have evidence for in the medieval character dictionaries. And this has been sometimes proposed in some articles, but I would say never really thoroughly researched or discussed, and never really discussed also in the light of derivational morphology. And what we will look at today is that early scribes sometimes could basically resort to 2 different strategies. So the alternation between the 本字, so the original character, and the 通假字, the phonetic loans, or the alternation between properly called 一体, so allographs, to differentiate different morphosyntactic usages of an entry. And why is it that this phenomenon has received so little attention, has not really been discussed? Well, I think the main reason why it is so, it's because it's not really systematic. We don't find it in all manuscripts or in the entire corpus of excavated manuscripts. Sometimes word entries that we know had different readings, different morphosyntactic usages, like this pai, the very famous one, are almost exempt from graphic variation in the true manuscripts. Or sometimes we find some kind of distinction, but we don't really have evidence for a morphological distinction, a phonological distinction. So it's not systematic. So how can we find examples to prove this point, to argue at least for this point? We need clear selection criteria. These are mine. I seek a threshold of systematicity within one and the same manuscript. So this is not something we can find in all manuscripts in the entire corpus, but we can indeed find some manuscripts that seem to really have, to be really consistent in the usage of the variants, okay? And this also allows us to think that these distinctions were deliberate by the same scribe, because in most of the cases, we assume that a single manuscript was copied, was written by one scribe. This is certainly true for many cases, not all cases again, but it's a criterion. The manuscript consistently operates a graphic distinction for different morphosyntactic usages of the same word type. And we have at least 2 different Middle Chinese readings attested in the Jingdian Shuwen or in the Qieyun. So it's basically an argument of consilience. We have evidence from paleography. We have evidence from from phonology, from medieval character dictionaries. And this is the basis for these examples here. So in order to make this clearer, I show some examples that I have rejected. For example, this case here, we have the verb xian. We know xian had 2 readings, a pingsheng reading and a chusheng reading. We could speculate that this character here, this variant written with the zhouzhipang, with the chuo, is something used to mark the verbal reading, okay, so the chusheng reading. But since this is not systematic within the manuscript, within the Geling Jiasan, I reject this example. Another case here, this Ji in the Hengxian manuscript, we have 2 examples. In one case, we have the Zhi, the foot element, that is somehow a shortened variant of the Zhouzhipang, of the Chuo we saw before. And it seems a verb. In the second case, we have the Xinzi Di, and it seems more like a noun, but we don't have evidence for reading distinctions of this G here. So again, I reject this example. So let's have a look at some examples for which I have found examples aligning with these selection criteria. These are all the words for which I have found relevant examples. We are not going to look at all of them, of course, but I hope to make the point clear. So let's look at the first strategy, the alternation between the Tongjiazi and the Benzi, okay? This is very nice, very nice example. It comes from the Caomo Zhizhen manuscripts. The Caomo Zhizhen is a text we have in 2 different manuscript copies, manuscript versions. One is in the Shanghai Museum collection, the other one is in the Anhui University collection. And the 2 manuscripts are striking. They're very consistent in the way they both use the same graphic variant. We can see here we have only 2 examples, but there are actually many more in the manuscripts, and it's really consistent. We can see that this Qinqi de Qin that we know also had 2 different readings, Pingsheng and a Chusheng reading. The Chusheng reading was perhaps the nominalized reading, so Qinjia in the Guangyun, so relatives, or even the transitive reading, or the causative reading. We have a gloss in the Jingdian Shuwen Qinzhi to the Yili. Okay, so we know that there was somehow a phonological distinction. In these cases here, in the manuscript, in both manuscripts, we have the first variant, which is the Benzi for Qin, used for the intransitive usages or the adverbial usages of Qin. Well, in the second case, we have the Xin, the Tongjiazi Xin, used for the transitive, for the causative examples, which is also thought-provoking because if we look at the reconstruction in Baxter and Sagar, we can see that Xin is also reconstructed with a pre-initial S that we know could function as a transitivizing or causativizing prefix. Okay, so is this a coincidence? Is this just coincidental that this very Tongjiazi is used here for those readings in both manuscripts? Maybe it's speculation, but I mean, this is certainly thought-provoking. and we should perhaps take it into account. Another example from another example from the Tangmo Zhezhen manuscripts is these two variants for the word jiang, okay, that we also know had two readings, a Pingsheng and a Tusheng reading. The Tusheng reading was used for the nominalized version, so the meaning general, or as a verb meaning to lead. And in all cases where this jiang has a Pingsheng reading, both manuscripts use the first variant here, the Tongjiazi, this jiang here. This is also true for the compound jiangjun that we know from the Jingdian Shuwen. This jiang has Pingsheng reading. And again, we have the first jiang here in both manuscripts. While all cases where we should read this jiang as a verb or as a noun, so to lead or general when it's used, in this way, we have the second variant, like in this example here, jiang che yi che. This is a verb to lead chariot with a charioteer, actually. Okay, and again, these are just some examples. There are many more in both manuscripts, but it's just to prove the point. The other strategy I was talking about is the alternation between yiqizi, between allograph. This example here is very famous. It has already been discussed by Lin Suqing. Also, Matthias Richter mentioned it in a recent paper. The distinction between Ming and Lin in the Kongzi Shilun manuscripts. We know that this Ming and Lin are not really distinguished in many cases in the true writing. But in the Kongzi Shilun manuscript, the distinction seems to be really systematic. Every time we should read this character as min, so as a noun, we have two additional strokes, okay, which indeed seem to be graphemic, so they are contrastive. While when we should read it as lin, we don't have the two additional strokes. This example is very striking because it's on the very same bamboo slip, as you can see here, 有命字天令字问王, okay? And the distinction seems indeed to be graphemic. But if we look at the way this manuscript has been transcribed in the latest edition by Yu Shaohong and Zhang Qingsong of the Shanghai corpus, we can see that the distinction is totally obliterated. It's not really reproduced in their transcription. And this is why it's really important to always go and look at the source, always go and look at the bamboo slips, because sometimes elements that are indeed graphemic and contrastive are sometimes really overlooked by people who who curate the editions of these manuscripts. Another example from the Laozi, which is also a wonderful text because we have glosses from the Jingdian Shuwen, the Guodian Laozi A. We can see that every time we should read this nan as Tusheng, the scribe used a variant with this tu element below, okay? In one case, we also have the Xinzi Di that probably relates more to the semantics, but this variant here with the tu is used every time we should read the character as Tusheng, as nan. While the benzi, so this character here without the tu is used for the Pingsheng reading, as in this case, 不贵难得或 Pingsheng. Here we have 多易必多难, and we have the tu element. Again, we have 难之 positive reading. The gloss here is not from the Laozi, it's from the 左传 难之. Also 无难, this is a nominalized reading. Don't have difficulties, okay? Tusheng reading, and we have the tu element. Also in this case here, nan yi zhi xiang cheng. This is again nominalized. We have the nan, but we also have the Xinzi Di that parallels also the Xinzi Di in the yi character, okay? That we have just on the side. Another example, this xiang, we know this xiang also had Pingsheng and Tusheng reading. The Pingsheng reading is an adverb, okay, mutually, while the Tusheng reading is for the nominalized usage or the verbal usage, meaning to assist, to help. Again, we have several examples also for this distinction. In this case, the Naiming R. This example is from the same bamboo slip. 相受会也以向上 正下, okay? The second one is a verb, and we have an additional element, probably marking a distinction between the two entries. Another manuscript where we have this is the 瑞良府币. As you can see here in the first example is 相互, so mutually turn the back on one other, and we have the basic character. While when we should read this character as a verb, we have the 直 element below, which is, as I was saying before, somehow a shortened variant of the 走着旁 we saw before. And this is clearly 去声 reading, okay, 为向设计, okay, to defend and aid the altars of soil and grain. Same thing here, the nominalized usage, 五相, the 5 ministers, also has this 直 element, because again, this is 去声 is nominalized. Last example is more problematic, but also I think very thought-provoking. It comes from a Western Han manuscript, the Beida Laozi, which is an extremely beautifully crafted manuscript. It's very polished. It was copied perhaps during the reign of Han Wudi. And it's an amazing manuscript. It already has the character Jing in the title, so the Laozi was already a canonical scripture, a classic. And in this line here, which comes from the slip number 34 and equates to a passage we also have in the Laozi stanza number 50 of the received edition, we can see there's a distinction between these two sheng, okay? We have min, sheng, sheng, yan, okay? These two sheng. Well, this caught my attention because I thought, why didn't scribe use a chongwen hao here? Which is something we find, for example, in the Ma Wangdui versions of the Laozi for this stanza here, for this line. And I think this is also related to a distinction in reading. Probably the scribe really wanted to mark a distinction in the usage of the two sheng, and that's why he resorted to a variant. This is a translation by Henriks. Actually, the translation is a translation of the Ma Wangdui manuscript, not the Beida one, but it works just fine in this case. The people, they regard life as life. So the first sheng is a verb, is causative. The second one is an object, okay? And if we look at the different versions of the Laozi, it's very interesting because we can really isolate two groups. The first one is the group of manuscripts, including the Fuyi edition that we know originated in the Sui dynasty with the discovery of a Western Han manuscript. And the manuscript editions all have the double sheng, okay? While in the other received edition, the Wang Bi, the He Shang Gong, we have only one sheng, so one sheng was dropped. I think this is somehow a simpler reading, a lectio facilior, the one that we have in the received edition. And so perhaps the intention of the scribe here in the Beida Laozi was really to find a way to mark a distinction in reading for a reading that was perhaps already difficult or obscure to make sense of. And we have this sheng sheng also in other texts, for example, in the Zhuangzi, sha sheng zhe bu si, sheng sheng zhe bu sheng, okay? What kills all life without death begins all life without beginning. Again, this sheng sheng is verb and object. We have a gloss also by Cui Zhuan saying, 常营其生为sheng sheng. So constantly nurturing his life is what is meant by sheng sheng, verb and object. So I think the distinction here is also related perhaps to a reading distinction. We have evidence for a reading distinction for this sheng here, but the data we get from the Jingdian Shuwen is a bit opaque, I would say. We have this sheng is glossed 3 times in the Jingdian Shuwen. In all 3 times, it's used as a transitive verb, so to generate or to father someone, okay? And the Jingdian Shuwen is not really clear because it says, well, you can read it either Ping Sheng or Tu Sheng or even Shang Sheng in one case. So probably the distinction was already out of the language, was not really clear to the compiler of the Jingdian Shuwen. But the distinction we have in this manuscript here that appears twice in the manuscript seems to point that perhaps there really was a distinction in reading between these different morphosyntactic usages of sheng. So to wrap up, we often tend to describe the Chinese writing as underspecified. This is certainly true. But what I wanted to show with this example is that sometimes early scribes could perhaps resort to different variants, to systematic usage of variants to mark different usages, different meanings, and even different readings, okay? The strategies were not fixed, so sometimes we find one strategy in one manuscript and another one in another manuscript. So we need to look for a threshold of systematicity, but we can only find systematicity within one and the same manuscript, so not in the entire true corpus. And this also, I mean, it's also relevant because I think we should always look at characters, at variants, and at phonetic loans in context. We tend to just to take phonetic loans to do linguistic research, which is fairly fine, but sometimes also the context can add some some information to our investigation. And what does this tell us about Old Chinese derivational morphology? Why is it relevant? Well, this phenomenon provides further evidence for the authenticity of some medieval reading variants, which is something that, as you all know, has been long debated. Investigating morphosyntactically driven cases of graphic variation in excavated texts further sheds light on the state of morphology in the Warring States to Han period. Most of the examples we saw before relate to the S suffix, the Chushan derivation, contributes to the investigation of the frequently opaque data found in medieval glosses. As we have seen in the last example, the Jingdian points to different readings of this sheng, but it's not very clear. But we can find some graphic distinction in the excavated manuscripts. Last but not least, having also this kind of lens could enhance our philological practice, our practice of making sense of excavated texts and even transmitted texts, as in the case of the Laozi that we saw before. So I hope this was clear, and I'm really happy to hear from you, and thank you very much. I actually have one extra slide here. This is something I was interested in, the Mesopotamian script, where we have some kind of markers for a reading distinction. For example, the semantic complements or the phonetic, the phonetic elements that mark a distinction. This is something that, of course, logographic scripts can tend to develop to make, to disambiguate